The knock on the study door came like a hammer against Charlotte Ashby's chest, though she stood 2 rooms away, pressed against the cold wall of the hallway, listening. "You cannot mean this," her mother's voice trembled through the thick oak door. "Henry, she is our daughter." "She is the only thing of value I have left," her father answered, his tone flat and tired, as if he had already surrendered to the words leaving his mouth. "Lord Crane has agreed to clear every debt, every last shilling. The house stays ours. Do you understand what that means, Margaret? We keep the house." Charlotte's hand rose to her mouth to stop the sound that wanted to escape her throat. Lord Edmund Crane. She had heard the name whispered in the village, always in hushed, careful tones, always followed by a quick change of subject. His first wife had died within a year of their marriage, and no one in the county spoke of how. "There must be another way," her mother pleaded. "There is no other way," her father said. "The bank will take everything within the month. Everything, Margaret. Charlotte will have nothing either way. At least this way she has a roof over her head, and we have ours." Charlotte stepped back from the door, her legs unsteady beneath her long gray dress. The hallway seemed to tilt, the portraits of ancestors on the wall staring down at her, with painted, indifferent eyes. She had known for weeks that her father's debts had grown beyond anything he could repay. She had seen the letters he tried to hide in his desk drawer, the red wax seals of moneylenders, the increasingly threatening tone of each new arrival, but she had never imagined he would sell her future to solve it. She found Eliza Whitfield in the garden an hour later, sitting on the stone bench beneath the old elm tree where the 2 of them had spent every summer of their childhood whispering secrets. Eliza took one look at Charlotte's face and set down the basket of flowers she had been arranging. "What has happened?" "My father is going to give me to Lord Crane," Charlotte said, the words feeling strange and unreal even as she spoke them, as though she were describing a story that belonged to someone else. Eliza's face went pale. "Crane? Charlotte, no. You cannot. Everyone knows what happened to his first wife. They say she fell down the stairs, but the servants say otherwise. They say she was afraid of him long before she died. I know what they say." Charlotte sat down heavily on the bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap to stop them from shaking. "But my father owes him money, a great deal of money. If I refuse, we lose the house, and my mother and father will have nowhere to go." "Then let them lose the house," Eliza said fiercely. "A house is not worth your life." Charlotte said nothing. She wanted to agree, wanted to feel the same fierce certainty her friend felt, but a lifetime of being told that a daughter's duty was to her family had settled deep into her bones. She had watched her mother sacrifice everything for her father's comfort. She had watched her father sacrifice nothing for anyone, and now it seemed her turn had come. "When does he mean to send you to Crane?" Eliza asked quietly. "I don't know. Soon, I think. I heard him say the papers were nearly ready." That evening, Charlotte sat at the small writing desk in her bedroom and stared at a blank sheet of paper, trying to compose a letter to an aunt in the north who might, perhaps, offer her shelter. But she knew, even as she dipped the pen in ink, that the letter would arrive too late, if it arrived at all. Her father controlled every letter that left the house. He controlled everything. She was still sitting there, the candle burning low, when she heard the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel drive below. She rose and went to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to look down without being seen. A carriage, black and unmarked except for a small silver crest on the door, had stopped in front of the house. A tall man stepped out, wrapped in a dark coat despite the mild evening, his face obscured by shadow until he turned toward the light spilling from the front windows. Even from this distance, Charlotte felt something in her chest tighten. There was a stillness to the way he moved, a controlled and deliberate quality, like a man who had long ago decided that showing haste to anyone was a weakness he would never allow himself. She heard voices below, her father's voice rising in surprise, then dropping into something more careful and measured. She could not make out the words, but she recognized the tone. It was the tone her father used with men he feared. Curiosity pulled her from her room before caution could stop her. She crept halfway down the staircase, staying in the shadow where the candlelight from the entrance hall could not reach her, and looked down at the visitor standing in the foyer. He was younger than she expected, though there was nothing youthful in his expression. His dark hair was pushed back from a face carved with sharp, unforgiving lines, and his eyes, when they lifted briefly toward the staircase, were the pale gray of a winter sky. For one terrible moment, Charlotte was certain he had seen her, though he gave no sign of it, his gaze already returning to her father. "Mr. Ashby," the visitor said, his voice low and even, carrying easily through the quiet house. "I understand you have taken a great deal of interest in delaying our arrangement. Your Grace, I only meant to say that the timing has grown complicated. her father said, and Charlotte's stomach dropped at the title. This was no ordinary creditor. This was a duke. Complicated, the man repeated, as though tasting the word and finding it unpleasant. I have heard, Mr. Ashby, that you intend to marry your daughter to Lord Crane in order to settle your debts elsewhere, while my own debt remains unpaid. Her father's silence answered for him. I see, the Duke said. Then let me be plain. I did not come here tonight to discuss delay. I came to collect what is owed to me, one way or another. Charlotte's heart pounded so loudly she was certain the men below could hear it. She pressed herself further into the shadow of the staircase, watching as her father's shoulders sagged with the particular defeat of a man who has run out of excuses. Your Grace, I do not have the sum. Not tonight, perhaps not for many months. Then we will need to discuss another arrangement, the Duke said, and something in his voice made Charlotte's skin prickle, though she could not have said whether it was fear or something else entirely. One that does not involve Lord Crane. Her father looked up sharply. What arrangement do you propose? The Duke did not answer immediately. Instead, his gaze lifted once more toward the staircase, and this time Charlotte was certain, absolutely certain, that he saw her standing there in the dark, half hidden behind the banister in her nightdress with her hair loose around her shoulders. He did not smile. He did not react at all. He simply looked at her for a long moment, as though weighing something in his mind, before he turned back to her father. We will speak of it tomorrow, he said, in private. Send your daughter to bed, Mr. Ashby. It grows late, and this is not a conversation for young ears. Charlotte did not wait to hear more. She turned and fled up the remaining stairs, her bare feet silent on the worn carpet, her mind racing faster than her heart. She did not know who this man was beyond his title, did not know what arrangement he meant to propose, but she knew one thing, with sudden, terrible clarity as she closed her bedroom door and leaned against it, breathing hard in the darkness. Whatever tomorrow brought, her life was no longer her own to plan. She did not sleep that night. She lay awake, listening to the low murmur of voices that continued in the study below for another hour, before the front door opened and closed, and the carriage wheels rolled away into the darkness. Even then, sleep would not come. She thought of Lord Crane's cold reputation, and she thought of the stranger's pale gray eyes finding hers across the dim foyer, and she could not decide which frightened her more, the man she was meant to marry, or the man who had just decided her fate instead. By morning, word had already begun to spread through the house. She heard it from the housemaid who brought her breakfast tray, spoken in a careful whisper as though the walls themselves might carry the news back to the wrong ears. The visitor from the night before had been Duke Alexander Vane of Harrow, a man known throughout the county for his ruthless dealings and his unshakable composure, a man who was said to have never once broken a bargain or forgiven a debt. And he had asked to see her father again, alone, before noon. Charlotte dressed slowly, her hands unsteady with the buttons of her dress, her mind turning over every possibility and finding none of them comforting. Whatever waited for her downstairs, she understood now that her fate had already slipped from her father's careless hands into the hands of a stranger, far more dangerous than Lord Crane could ever hope to be. She descended the stairs just as the study door opened and her father stepped out, his face pale and strange, caught somewhere between relief and dread. Charlotte, he said, and for the first time in years his voice cracked with something that might have been shame. The Duke wishes to speak with you. She stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, her hands still resting on the polished banister, unable to make her feet move any further. Her father would not meet her eyes. He looked instead at the floor between them, at his own worn boots, as if the answer to every question might be found there instead of in his daughter's face. What does he want with me? Charlotte asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer and did not want to hear it spoken aloud. Go in and find out, her father said quietly. It is better than what waited for you with Crane. I promise you that much. The words did nothing to ease the tightness in her chest. She walked past him into the study, and he did not follow her inside. The door closed behind her with a soft, final click, and she found herself alone with the Duke of Harrow for the first time. He stood near the tall window, his back partly turned to her, looking out over the overgrown garden with the same still, deliberate quality she had noticed the night before. When he turned to face her, his pale gray eyes studied her without hurry, as though he had all the time in the world and intended to use every moment of it. Miss Ashby, he said, please, sit. Charlotte sat, though her spine remained rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Your Grace, my father tells me you wish to speak with me. I did. He remained standing, his hands folded behind his back. I understand your father has arranged your marriage to Lord Crane, in exchange for the settlement of his debts. Charlotte's throat tightened. Yes. Do you wish to marry him? The question startled her so completely that for a moment she could not answer. No one had ever asked her what she wished for. Not once, in all the weeks since the arrangement had begun. No, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I do not. Something shifted behind the Duke's eyes, though his expression remained otherwise unreadable. Then perhaps, he said, we should discuss another possibility before your father signs anything further. Charlotte's heart beat hard against her ribs, uncertain whether what she felt was hope or a fresh and different kind of fear. Whatever the Duke intended to say next, she understood that the course of her entire life was about to change with his next words, and there was nothing she could do now but listen. EQ. I will clear every debt your father owes, the Duke said, his voice as calm as if he were discussing the weather rather than a woman's entire future. Every shilling to every creditor, including myself. In exchange, you will marry me instead of Lord Crane. Charlotte stared at him, certain she had misheard. Marry you? Yes. You do not know me, she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. You have spoken to me for less than a minute. Why would you offer such a thing? The Duke's expression did not change, but something in his stillness seemed to sharpen, like a man choosing his words with great care. I have my reasons. They need not concern you. What concerns you is this. You have two paths before you. One leads to a man whose last wife did not survive her first year of marriage. The other leads to me, a man who has no interest in harming you, and every intention of honoring whatever arrangement we make. That is not a comfort, Your Grace. Forgive me, but I know nothing of your intentions beyond what you tell me now. No, he agreed, you do not. But you know something of Lord Crane, and I suspect that is enough to make your choice for you. Charlotte's hands twisted in her lap. He was right, and the unfairness of it burned in her throat. She was being asked to choose between two strangers, one whose cruelty was already known to her, and one whose intentions remained a complete mystery. It was hardly a choice at all. What would you expect of me, she asked slowly, as your wife? Very little, the Duke said. You would live in my household, bear my name, and appear beside me when duty requires it. Beyond that, I have no wish to trouble you. I do not expect affection, Miss Ashby. I do not offer it either. This would be an arrangement, nothing more. There was something almost merciful in his bluntness, Charlotte thought. At least he did not pretend. At least he did not dress the transaction in false tenderness the way her father had tried to dress his own betrayal. And my family? Your father's debts to me will be forgiven entirely upon our marriage. What arrangement he has made with Lord Crane will be dissolved. I will see to it personally. Charlotte looked down at her hands, turning the Duke's offer over in her mind like a stone she could not quite decide whether to pick up. She thought of Lord Crane's cold reputation, the whispers that followed his name through every drawing room in the county. She thought of her mother's frightened eyes the night before, and her father's hollow voice speaking of debts as though her future were simply another column in his ledger. And she thought, too, of the strange stillness in the Duke's expression, the way he had asked her what she wished for when no one else had thought to ask at all. If I agree, she said carefully, I would want your word that you will never raise a hand against me, nor allow harm to come to me under your roof. You have it, the Duke said without hesitation, and something in the immediacy of his answer eased a small measure of the fear coiled in her chest. I do not tolerate cruelty in my household, Miss Ashby. You will find my servants well treated and well paid, and you will be no different. Charlotte took a slow breath. Then I accept, Your Grace. The Duke inclined his head, a small, formal gesture that carried no warmth but no coldness either. Then it is settled. We will marry within the fortnight. I will send my own carriage for you when the arrangements are complete. He turned to leave, and Charlotte, driven by a boldness she did not entirely understand, spoke again before he reached the door. Your Grace, may I ask why you truly wish to marry me? A man in your position could have his choice of any bride in the country. Why a stranger with nothing to offer but a family debt? The Duke paused at the door, his hand resting briefly on the frame. For a long moment, Charlotte thought he would not answer at all. Then, without turning to face her, he spoke quietly. Because I know what it is to be sold for someone else's convenience, Miss Ashby. I would not wish that fate on anyone, least of all a woman who has done nothing to deserve it. He left before she could ask what he meant, the study door closing softly behind him, and Charlotte sat alone in the sudden silence, her heart pounding with questions that had no answers yet. Her father entered the room only a moment later, his face flushed with something between relief and disbelief. He has agreed to clear everything, he said, as though he still could not quite believe his own good fortune. Every debt, Charlotte. and Crane's arrangement is finished. You have saved this family." Charlotte looked at her father, at the man who had been prepared to send her to a monster only the night before, and felt something cold settle in her chest where gratitude should have been. "I did not save this family, father. I simply chose the lesser danger." "There is a difference." Her father's face fell, but he said nothing more, and Charlotte rose and left the room without another word, climbing the stairs to find Eliza waiting anxiously in her bedroom, having heard the news already from the servants. "Is it true?" Eliza asked the moment the door closed. "You are to marry the Duke of Harrow?" "It seems so." Charlotte sank onto the edge of her bed, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the sleepless night before.
"I do not know whether to feel relieved or terrified."
"Perhaps both," Eliza said gently, sitting beside her and taking her hand. "What is he like?" Charlotte considered the question carefully, remembering the Duke's pale gray eyes, his measured voice, the strange honesty of his final words before he left the room. "Cold," she said finally, "but not cruel. I think there is a great deal he does not say, Eliza, a great deal hidden beneath that composure of his." "That could be dangerous," Eliza said, "or it could simply mean he has been hurt before, and does not know how to show anything else." Charlotte thought of what the Duke had said about being sold for someone else's convenience, and wondered which of Eliza's guesses was closer to the truth. The following days passed in a strange blur of preparation. Seamstresses arrived to fit her for a wedding dress far finer than anything she had ever owned, though the fittings felt less like preparation for joy and more like preparation for battle. Each pin and measurement another step toward a life she could not yet imagine. Her mother wept over the sudden change in fortune, alternating between gratitude for the Duke's generosity and worry over what kind of husband he might prove to be. Her father, for his part, seemed to have already forgotten the price his daughter was paying, too relieved by his own rescue to spare much thought for hers. Lord Crane, when word reached him of the broken arrangement, did not take the news quietly. Charlotte heard from the servants that he had ridden to her father's house in a fury, demanding an explanation, only to be turned away at the gate on the Duke's standing orders. She did not see the confrontation herself, but she heard enough second-hand accounts to understand that Lord Crane's anger had not faded with the closing of the gate. If anything, it seemed to have deepened into something colder and more dangerous, a grudge that would not simply disappear because the arrangement had ended. "He will not forget this," Eliza warned her one evening, arranging flowers for the wedding that now loomed only days away. "Men like Crane do not forgive being denied what they believe belongs to them." "I know," Charlotte admitted, "but there is nothing to be done about it now. The papers are signed, the wedding is set. Whatever anger Lord Crane feels, it is the Duke's concern as much as mine now." She did not entirely believe her own words, but she said them anyway, needing some small comfort to carry her through the days ahead. On the morning of her wedding, Charlotte stood before the mirror in her bedroom, watching the maid fasten the final buttons of her gown, and hardly recognized the woman staring back at her. She looked, she thought, like a stranger dressed for someone else's life. Downstairs, the carriage that would carry her to the church waited in the drive, its silver crest gleaming in the pale morning light, and beyond it, somewhere in the city, Duke Alexander Vane waited to make her his wife. She did not know yet what kind of man she was truly marrying, nor what secrets lay behind his careful composure. She knew only that the choice was made, the path set, and there was no turning back now, whatever waited for her at the end of the church aisle. The carriage ride to the church felt endless, though it lasted less than an hour. Charlotte sat beside her father in silence, watching the countryside pass by the window, her mind circling again and again back to the Duke's strange words in the study. Sold for someone else's convenience. What had he meant by that? What history lay buried beneath his cold exterior, waiting to surface? When the carriage finally stopped before the church, her father helped her down with unusual gentleness, and for a brief moment, something like remorse flickered across his face. "Charlotte," he said quietly, "I know I have failed you as a father these past weeks. I hope, in time, you can forgive me for it." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Perhaps in time, father, but not today." She turned from him and walked toward the church doors, where her new life waited, uncertain and unknown, on the other side. Inside, the church was smaller than she expected, and far emptier. There were no crowds of well-wishers, no rows of curious neighbors come to witness the joining of two families. Only a handful of witnesses stood near the altar, servants of the Duke's household by the look of their fine but plain clothing, and a stern-faced older woman, whose sharp eyes followed Charlotte's every step up the aisle with open suspicion. Duke Alexander Vane waited at the altar dressed in dark gray, his expression as composed and unreadable as it had been in her father's study. He did not smile as she approached, but neither did his gaze hold anything unkind. He simply watched her, steady and unwavering, as though committing the sight of her to memory. The ceremony passed quickly, the vicar's words falling into the quiet church like stones into still water, and Charlotte found herself repeating vows to a man she had known for barely a week, her voice steadier than she expected, though her heart raced beneath the fine silk of her gown. When the Duke slid the ring onto her finger, his hand was warm despite the coldness of his manner, and for one brief moment, his pale gray eyes met hers with something that might almost have been reassurance. "You may go," the vicar said at last, and it was done. Charlotte Ashby no longer existed. In her place stood Charlotte Vane, Duchess of Harrow, bound by law and vow to a man she barely knew. Outside the church, the sharp-eyed older woman approached as the Duke helped Charlotte into the waiting carriage. "Your Grace," she said, addressing the Duke with a brief, formal nod, before turning her attention to Charlotte with far less warmth. "I am Mrs. Dunmore, housekeeper of Harrow Hall. I will see that your things are settled properly upon your arrival." "Thank you," Charlotte said, offering a small smile that Mrs. Dunmore did not return. The carriage ride to Harrow Hall took the better part of the afternoon. The Duke seated across from her in silence for most of the journey, his gaze fixed on the passing countryside beyond the window. Charlotte studied him carefully in the quiet, searching his profile for some clue to the man beneath the title, but his expression gave nothing away. "Your housekeeper does not seem to approve of me," she said finally, breaking the silence more from nervous energy than any real desire for conversation. "Mrs. Dunmore approves of very little," the Duke said, though there was the faintest hint of something almost like humor in his voice. "She has run my household since before I inherited the title. She will grow accustomed to you in time, as she grows accustomed to everything, eventually. And you, Your Grace, will you grow accustomed to me as well?" He turned from the window then, studying her with the same careful attention he had shown in her father's study. "I imagine we will grow accustomed to each other, Duchess. That is, after all, what marriage requires, whatever the circumstances of its beginning." Charlotte held his gaze, searching for something warmer beneath the careful formality of his words, but found only that same unreadable stillness. Still, there had been no cruelty in his tone, no impatience, nothing to suggest the coldness others whispered about him extended to actual unkindness. It was, she supposed, a small comfort to carry into the unknown house that waited ahead. When the carriage finally crested a hill and Harrow Hall came into view, Charlotte could not stop the small gasp that escaped her. The estate stretched before them, vast and gray against the darkening sky, towers rising at each corner like silent sentinels, more fortress than home. It was beautiful in its own severe way, and utterly unlike anything she had ever imagined for herself. "It is not a warm house," the Duke said quietly, watching her reaction. "I will not pretend otherwise, but it is a safe one, Duchess. That much I can promise you." Charlotte looked at him, wondering again what history had shaped a man who spoke of safety before he spoke of comfort, who measured his promises so carefully and kept his warmth so tightly guarded. Whatever secrets Harrow Hall held within its gray stone walls, she understood now that she would have a great deal of time to uncover them, whether the Duke wished her to or not. The carriage rolled through the gates, and Charlotte Vane began the first night of her new life. The door to Charlotte's new chamber closed with a heavy sound, and for the first time since leaving her father's house, she found herself completely alone. The room was grand, far grander than anything she had known before, with tall windows overlooking dark gardens and a fireplace already lit against the evening chill. But there was a hollowness to its beauty that matched the strange hollowness settling in her chest. She crossed to the window and pressed her palm against the cold glass, looking out at the shadowed grounds of Harrow Hall. Somewhere in this vast house, her husband moved through rooms she had not yet seen, keeping to himself, as he had kept to himself throughout the entire carriage ride, offering nothing beyond careful courtesy and the barest scraps of conversation. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. When she opened the door, she found a young maid standing there, no older than herself, holding a tray of tea and bread. "Mrs. Dunmore thought you might be hungry, my lady," the maid said, her eyes flicking nervously between Charlotte and the hallway behind her, as though afraid of being caught speaking too freely. "I am Grace. I have been assigned to attend you." "Thank you, Grace." Charlotte stepped aside to let her in, grateful for even this small kindness. "Please, sit with me a moment, if you have time." Grace hesitated, clearly unused to such an invitation from someone of Charlotte's new station, but she perched carefully on the edge of a chair near the fire, while Charlotte poured the tea herself. "May I ask you something?" Charlotte said. "About the Duke." Grace's expression tightened slightly. I would rather not speak out of turn, my lady. I am not asking you to gossip. I only wish to understand the household I have joined. Is he a difficult master? No, my lady, Grace said, seeming to relax slightly at the honesty of the question. He is fair, stern, but fair. He pays well and does not tolerate cruelty among the staff, but he keeps himself apart from everyone. Even Mrs. Dunmore, who has served him since he was a boy, says she knows little of what happens behind his study door. Has he always been this way? Distant? Grace glanced toward the door again before lowering her voice further. Not always, my lady, or so I have heard. Something changed him, years ago, before I came to service here. The older staff speak of it sometimes, when they think no one is listening, but never plainly. Whatever happened, it left its mark on him. Charlotte turned the words over carefully, filing them away alongside the fragments the Duke himself had offered in her father's study, sold for someone else's convenience. Whatever had happened to him, it seemed to have taught him the same lesson she herself had learned only days before, that a person's worth could be measured in debts and bargains rather than affection. The following weeks settled into a careful, distant rhythm. Charlotte rose each morning to find the Duke already gone from the breakfast table, occupied with estate business that seemed to consume every waking hour of his day. They dined together most evenings, though the conversation rarely extended beyond polite inquiries about her comfort and brief accounts of his own activities. He was never unkind to her, never impatient or cold in the way she had feared, but neither did he offer anything beyond the careful courtesy of two strangers sharing a house. Mrs. Dunmore, for her part, remained watchful and cool, correcting Charlotte's small missteps and managing the household with a patience that felt more like tolerance than warmth. Charlotte understood, without being told directly, that the housekeeper's loyalty belonged entirely to the Duke, and that any trust from her would have to be earned slowly, through actions rather than words. It was on a gray afternoon, nearly 3 weeks into her new life at Harrow Hall, that Charlotte first glimpsed something beneath the Duke's careful composure. She had wandered into the east wing of the house, an area she had not yet explored, drawn by curiosity toward a closed door at the end of a long, dim corridor. When she pushed it open, she found herself in what had clearly once been a nursery, the furniture covered in white sheets, a faded rocking horse standing forgotten in the corner, dust thick on every surface. She was still standing in the doorway, taking in the sad little room, when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find the Duke standing in the corridor, his face paler than she had ever seen it, his composure cracked in a way she had not witnessed before. "You should not be in here," he said, his voice tight and strange. "I am sorry," Charlotte said quickly, stepping back into the corridor. "I did not know. I was only exploring the house. I did not mean to intrude." He said nothing for a long moment, his jaw working as though he were fighting to master some powerful emotion. Then, quietly, almost as if speaking to himself rather than to her, he said, "It was my sister's room." Charlotte went very still. "Your sister?" "She died when I was 17. He looked past Charlotte into the shadowed nursery, his pale gray eyes distant, focused on something far beyond the dusty room before them. "She was only 12. It was a fever that took her. Nothing more sinister than that, though it felt like the cruelest thing the world had ever done." "I am so sorry," Charlotte said softly, and meant it completely. The Duke's gaze returned to her, sharp and searching, as though surprised by the genuine sympathy in her voice. "You need not apologize. It was a long time ago." He reached past her and closed the nursery door with careful, deliberate movements, sealing the room and its memories away once more. "I do not often speak of her. Forgive me. I am not accustomed to explaining myself. You do not owe me an explanation, Your Grace, but I am glad you told me, all the same." Something shifted in his expression then, some small crack in the careful wall he had built around himself, though he said nothing further as he turned and walked away down the corridor, leaving Charlotte alone with the closed door and the strange, unexpected tenderness blooming in her chest for a man she had believed incapable of grief. That evening at dinner, the Duke seemed different, quieter than usual but somehow less distant, as though the small confession in the corridor had loosened something between them. Charlotte found herself studying him across the long table, searching for more fragments of the man hidden beneath the Duke of Harrow's cold reputation. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" she said carefully, as the servants cleared the final course. "You may. You told me once, in my father's study, that you knew what it was to be sold for someone else's convenience. I have wondered ever since what you meant by it." The Duke set down his glass slowly, and for a long moment, Charlotte thought he would refuse to answer, retreating instead behind the same careful silence he had maintained since her arrival. But then he spoke, his voice low and measured, each word chosen with obvious care. "My father was not a kind man, Duchess. When my sister died, something broke in him, and what remained turned cold and calculating. He arranged my first engagement when I was barely 20, to a woman I had never met, the daughter of a business partner whose alliance he wished to secure. I had no say in the matter. My wishes did not enter into his calculations at all. What happened to the engagement? She died before the wedding could take place. An illness, much like my sister's." His voice remained level, but Charlotte could see the effort it cost him to keep it so. "My father arranged a second engagement within the year, to another woman, for another alliance. I began to understand, then, that I would never be permitted to choose my own path. I would simply be moved from one arrangement to another, like a piece on a chessboard, for as long as my father lived. And after he died? I swore I would never again allow myself to be bargained over as though I were nothing more than a debt to be settled." He looked at her then, steady and direct. "When I learned of your father's arrangement with Lord Crane, I recognized something of my own history in it. I could not stand by and watch it happen to someone else, not when I had the means to stop it." Charlotte sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the weight of what he had shared. "Then our marriage," she said slowly, "was not merely a business arrangement to you. It was something more personal." "Perhaps," the Duke admitted, and something in his tone suggested this admission cost him more than any of the words that had come before it. "I had not considered it in such terms until now." The conversation drifted after that into safer waters, but Charlotte found herself unable to stop thinking of what he had revealed, turning the pieces over in her mind long after she had retired to her chamber for the night. The cold, distant Duke of Harrow, it seemed, was not cold at all, merely guarded. A man who had learned through repeated loss that warmth extended to others only invited further pain. Over the following days, small changes began to appear in their careful routine. The Duke began joining her for breakfast more often than not, and their dinner conversations grew longer, touching on subjects beyond polite necessity. He asked, one evening, about her own childhood, and Charlotte found herself telling him of summers spent with Eliza beneath the old elm tree, of her mother's gentle nature worn thin by years of her father's poor decisions, of the small dreams she had once held for herself before duty had swallowed them whole. "What did you dream of?" the Duke asked, genuine curiosity coloring his voice for the first time since she had known him. "Foolish things," Charlotte said, embarrassed suddenly by the admission. "I wished to travel, to see the places I had only read about in books. My father always said such dreams were unbecoming for a young woman of our station, that I ought to focus instead on securing a good match. I do not think it foolish," the Duke said quietly. "I think it is the first true thing you have told me about yourself, Duchess, rather than what duty or circumstance required you to say." Charlotte looked up, startled by the warmth in his voice, and found him watching her with an expression she had not seen before, something softer than the careful courtesy of their earlier weeks together. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them charged with something new and unfamiliar. It was Mrs. Dunmore who broke the moment, entering the room with a message that required the Duke's immediate attention, and the warmth in his expression retreated once more behind careful composure as he rose to attend to it. But Charlotte carried the memory of that look with her long after he had left the room, a small, precious thing to hold against the uncertainty of her new life. She did not yet know what lay ahead, what dangers still circled at the edges of her fragile new happiness, but for the first time since her father's fateful announcement weeks before, Charlotte Vane allowed herself to hope that her marriage might become something more than the careful bargain it had begun as. That hope was tested sooner than she expected. A few mornings later, Charlotte found Mrs. Dunmore standing in the hallway outside the breakfast room, a folded newspaper clutched tightly in her hand, her expression tighter than usual. "Is something wrong, Mrs. Dunmore?" Charlotte asked. The housekeeper hesitated, then handed her the paper without a word. Charlotte scanned the page and felt her stomach twist. A small article, tucked among the society gossip, spoke of the Duke of Harrow's hasty marriage to a young woman of little fortune, suggesting, in careful but pointed language, that the new Duchess had once been promised to another man before some scandal drove her from that arrangement. "This is not true," Charlotte said, her hands trembling slightly as she set the paper down. "There was no scandal. My father simply owed a debt, and Lord Crane offered to settle it in exchange for my hand. The Duke offered a kinder arrangement instead." "I did not think it was true, my lady," Mrs. Dunmore said, and something in her voice had softened, just slightly, from its usual cool formality. But someone wished it printed all the same. I thought His Grace should see it before anyone else brings it to his attention. Do you think it was Lord Crane? I could not say for certain, Mrs. Dunmore admitted, but I know Lord Crane does not accept losses gracefully. I have heard it said in the village that he considers your marriage to His Grace a personal insult, one he does not intend to forget. Charlotte carried the paper to the Duke herself, finding him already at work in his study, and watched his expression darken as he read the article twice over. This is Crane's doing, he said finally, setting the paper aside with controlled but obvious anger. He cannot touch me directly, so he means to wound you instead, hoping to damage your standing and force some crack between us. Will it work? Charlotte asked quietly. The Duke looked up at her, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something fierce and protective flare behind his careful gray eyes. No, he said, it will not. I will not allow gossip to unravel what little peace we have built here, Duchess. Whatever Crane intends, he will find me a far more difficult opponent than your father ever was. His certainty steadied her more than she expected, though a small knot of worry remained lodged beneath her ribs. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that once the marriage was settled, Lord Crane's anger would fade into nothing more than wounded pride. Now she understood that hope had been naive. A man like Crane did not simply let go of what he believed belonged to him. What will you do? She asked. For now, nothing that gives him the satisfaction of a reaction, the Duke said. But I will make certain word reaches the right people that the article is false, and I will keep a closer watch on Crane's movements than I have until now. In the meantime, I would ask that you avoid traveling beyond the estate grounds without informing me first. Charlotte nodded, though the request sent a small shiver of unease through her. You believe he might try something more direct? I believe Lord Crane is a man accustomed to getting what he wants, the Duke said grimly. And I do not intend to underestimate what he might do when denied it. Despite the unsettling turn the morning had taken, something had shifted between them in the sharing of this new danger, a fragile partnership beginning to form where before there had only been careful distance. Over the following days, the Duke made a point of walking with her through the gardens each evening, ostensibly to discuss household matters but lingering afterward in conversation that had nothing to do with duty at all. Mrs. Dunmore, too, seemed to warm further, offering small kindnesses that had been absent in those first cold weeks, as though the shared concern over Crane's threat had convinced her, finally, that Charlotte belonged within the walls of Harrow Hall after all. You have won her over, the Duke observed one evening, watching Mrs. Dunmore direct the younger servants with unusual patience toward Charlotte's requests. That is no small accomplishment. She has outlasted 3 of my father's housekeepers through sheer stubbornness alone. I think she simply needed time to trust that I meant no harm to this house, Charlotte said. As did you, perhaps. The Duke's mouth curved into something almost like a smile, the first she had seen from him since their wedding day. Perhaps, he agreed, though I confess, Duchess, you have made that trust easier to give than I expected when I first proposed this arrangement. Charlotte felt warmth rise in her cheeks at the admission, and for a moment, standing together in the fading evening light of the garden, the looming threat of Lord Crane's wounded pride seemed distant and small against the fragile, growing warmth building steadily between them. Whether that warmth would be strong enough to withstand what still lay ahead, neither of them could yet say, but for tonight, at least, Charlotte allowed herself to simply enjoy the quiet company of the man who was slowly, carefully, becoming far more than a stranger to her. Lord Edmund Crane sat alone in his study, a glass of brandy untouched at his elbow, staring at the letter that had arrived that morning from his solicitor. The Duke of Harrow had lodged a formal complaint regarding the false newspaper article, and worse, had begun quietly pressuring several of Crane's business associates to reconsider their dealings with him. Crane crumpled the letter in his fist, his jaw tight with fury he had been nursing for weeks. He had lost more than a bride when the arrangement with the Ashby family fell apart. He had lost face, publicly and humiliatingly, before men whose respect he had spent years cultivating. And worse than the humiliation was the knowledge that Charlotte Ashby, the woman who should have belonged to him, now lived in comfort and growing happiness inside Harrow Hall, protected by a man wealthier and more powerful than himself. He would not simply accept this defeat. Crane rose from his desk and crossed to the window, looking out over his own estate, far grander in appearance than in substance, its debts hidden carefully behind a facade of wealth that grew thinner each year. He needed the Ashby debt settlement more than the Duke could ever understand. He needed the humiliation avenged more than he needed anything else in the world just now. A knock at his study door interrupted his thoughts. His manservant entered, bearing a card from a visitor Crane had not expected but was, in this moment, entirely willing to receive. "Show her in," Crane said, a slow, cold smile spreading across his face for the first time in weeks. Meanwhile, at Harrow Hall, Charlotte spent her mornings increasingly occupied with the running of the household, guided now by a far warmer Mrs. Dunmore, who had taken to explaining the estate's workings with something approaching genuine patience. It was during one such lesson, as they reviewed the household accounts together in the small study off the kitchen, that Grace arrived breathless at the door. "My lady, there is a woman at the gate asking to see you," Grace said. "She says she is your friend." Eliza Whitfield. Charlotte's face broke into a smile she had not shown in weeks. "Eliza is here? Let her in at once, please." Eliza arrived moments later, flushed from her journey and clearly relieved to see Charlotte looking well. The two embraced tightly before settling into the small study, where Mrs. Dunmore tactfully excused herself to allow them privacy. "You look well," Eliza said, studying Charlotte carefully. "Better than I feared, if I am honest. I worried terribly after the wedding, not knowing what kind of household you had entered." "It has not been easy," Charlotte admitted, "but it has been better than I expected. The Duke is not the cold, cruel man his reputation suggests. There is a great deal of pain beneath his composure, but no cruelty, none at all." "I am glad to hear it." Eliza's expression grew more serious. "Charlotte, I did not come only to visit. I came because I heard something in the village that troubled me greatly, and I felt you ought to know of it." Charlotte's smile faded. "What have you heard?" "Lord Crane has been seen meeting privately with your father these past days," Eliza said carefully. "I do not know what business passes between them, but given everything that has happened, I cannot imagine it bodes well for you." A cold weight settled in Charlotte's stomach. "My father? But why would he speak with Crane now, after everything?" "I do not know," Eliza admitted. "But you know your father's weaknesses better than anyone, Charlotte. If Crane has found some new lever to pull, some new debt or desperation to exploit, I fear your father may not have the strength to resist him." Charlotte sat in troubled silence, turning the news over in her mind. She had believed, perhaps foolishly, that her father's debts to the Duke had severed his connection to Lord Crane entirely. But debts, she knew now, were rarely so simply resolved, and her father's weakness for easy solutions had not changed simply because his immediate crisis had passed. She sought out the Duke that same evening, finding him in his study reviewing correspondence by lamplight, and relayed Eliza's warning with careful precision. The Duke's expression darkened as he listened, his hand tightening around the letter he had been reading, until the paper crumpled slightly beneath his fingers. "Your father has always been susceptible to pressure," he said grimly. "If Crane has found some new means of leverage, I would not put it past him to attempt something reckless. What could Crane possibly offer my father now? You have already settled his debts. Money is not the only currency a man like Crane deals in," the Duke said. "He may have found some other weakness to exploit, fear perhaps, or old grudges I am not yet aware of. I will send inquiries tomorrow, to learn what business truly passes between them." Charlotte nodded, though unease continued to gnaw at her through the remainder of the evening. She thought of her father's easily bent will, his lifelong habit of choosing the path of least resistance regardless of the cost to others, and found herself dreading what new scheme might already be forming beyond the walls of Harrow Hall. The Duke's inquiries, when they returned 3 days later, brought news far worse than either of them had anticipated. Crane, it seemed, had approached her father not with threats but with a fabricated legal claim, asserting that the original marriage contract between Charlotte and Lord Crane had never been properly dissolved, and that the Duke's marriage to her was therefore invalid under law. It was a flimsy claim, built on manipulated paperwork and a bribed clerk, but flimsy claims could still cause considerable damage if pursued through the right channels, damage to reputation if nothing else, and damage that might take months or years to fully unravel in the courts. "He means to drag this through public proceedings," the Duke said, pacing his study with barely restrained anger as he explained the situation to Charlotte. "Even if the claim ultimately fails, and it will fail, the scandal alone could tarnish your name for years. That is precisely his intention. He cannot reclaim you through legitimate means, so he means to make your position as my wife as difficult and humiliating as possible instead." "And my father agreed to this?" Charlotte asked, though some tired, resigned part of her already knew the answer. "Crane offered him money to sign statements supporting the claim," the Duke said. "Enough money, apparently, to overcome whatever gratitude your father felt toward me for settling his original debts. I am sorry, Charlotte. I know this cannot be easy to hear." Charlotte closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the fresh betrayal with a weariness that had become almost familiar over these past months. "I am not surprised," she said finally. "Disappointed, perhaps, but not surprised. My father has never been a man of great strength when tested. The Duke crossed the room and knelt before her chair, an unusual gesture of closeness that startled her more than his words. Whatever legal games Crane wishes to play, I promise you this. He will not succeed in taking you from me, nor in destroying what we have built here. I have resources and connections he cannot begin to match, and I intend to use every one of them to protect you. Charlotte looked into his pale gray eyes, steady and fierce in a way she had rarely seen since their wedding day, and felt something warm bloom in her chest, despite the fear still coiling beneath it. "Thank you," she said softly, "for standing by me in this." "You are my wife," the Duke said simply, as though the matter required no further explanation at all. "I do not abandon what belongs to me, Charlotte, least of all to a man like Crane." The days that followed passed in tense preparation as the Duke's solicitors worked to counter Crane's fabricated claim, gathering evidence of the bribed clerk and the manipulated documents that formed the foundation of the false case. Charlotte found herself drawn more deeply into the Duke's confidence during this period, consulted on decisions and included in conversations that would once have taken place entirely without her knowledge. It was, she realized, a strange gift hidden within the crisis. This growing partnership forged in shared adversity, the walls between them crumbling faster under pressure than they ever had during the quiet weeks of careful courtesy that preceded it. But even as their bond strengthened, the danger surrounding them grew more pronounced. Word reached Harrow Hall that Lord Crane had begun making inquiries about Charlotte's daily movements, asking servants and villagers alike about her routines, her habits, the paths she walked when she ventured beyond the estate grounds. The Duke doubled the household security in response, stationing additional men at the gates and forbidding Charlotte from leaving the grounds without escort, but the sense of a closing net remained, tightening around them both with each passing day. "He will not stop with legal tricks," the Duke warned her one evening, his expression grave in the lamplight. "A man denied through proper channels often turns to improper ones. I need you to promise me you will exercise every caution, Charlotte, until this matter is fully resolved." "I promise," Charlotte said, though the fear in his voice, so carefully controlled and yet unmistakably present, frightened her more than any direct threat from Crane himself could have managed. A week later, an unexpected visitor arrived at Harrow Hall's gates. Charlotte was in the garden with Eliza, who had extended her stay at the Duke's quiet insistence, when Grace hurried out to inform her that her father waited in the receiving room, looking, in Grace's careful words, thoroughly wretched. Charlotte hesitated before agreeing to see him, uncertain whether she could bear another confrontation so soon after learning of his betrayal, but curiosity and a stubborn thread of old affection pulled her toward the house all the same. Her father sat stiffly in the receiving room, his hat clutched in both hands, looking older and more diminished than she remembered him from her wedding day. He rose when she entered, his eyes red-rimmed and shadowed with what looked like genuine sleeplessness. "Charlotte," he said, his voice rough, "thank you for seeing me. I would not have blamed you for refusing." "Why have you come, father?" Charlotte asked, keeping her tone carefully neutral, unwilling to offer forgiveness before she understood what he sought. "To confess," he said, and the words seemed to cost him considerable effort. "Crane approached me with money, and I took it, Charlotte. I signed papers I should never have signed, telling myself it was a small thing, a formality that would come to nothing. I told myself the same lie I have told myself my whole life, that this one compromise would be the last, that I would find some way to make it right afterward." He shook his head, his shoulders sagging further. "But it is not a small thing. I have seen since then what Crane truly intends, the lengths he means to go to reclaim what he believes is owed him, and I am ashamed, Charlotte. Truly ashamed." "What do you intend to do about it?" Charlotte asked, some of the coldness in her voice softening despite her efforts to maintain it. "I have already gone to the Duke's solicitors," her father said. "I have recanted my statement and told them the truth of Crane's bribe. In writing, sworn before witnesses. It will not undo the damage entirely, but it will weaken his claim considerably, perhaps fatally. I could not undo my failures as a father in one visit, Charlotte, but I could at least stop making them worse." Charlotte studied her father carefully, searching his weathered face for the manipulation she had come to expect from him, but found instead something that looked genuinely like remorse. "Why now?" "What changed?" "I saw him," her father said quietly. "Crane, I mean. After I signed the papers, he came to my house to ensure my continued cooperation, and I saw in his eyes something I had refused to see before, when I first considered giving you to him. I saw a man who does not simply want a wife, Charlotte. He wants possession, control, the satisfaction of claiming what was denied him regardless of the cost. I understood, finally, what I nearly condemned you to, and I could not live with having compounded that sin by helping him take you from a man who has clearly kept you safe and treated you with genuine care." Charlotte's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. "Thank you for telling the truth, Father. It does not erase what came before, but it matters. All the same, I do not expect forgiveness," her father said, rising to leave. "I only wished you to know that whatever else I have failed at, I did not fail to see, in the end, what truly mattered. Be careful, Charlotte. Crane will not accept this setback quietly. If anything, I fear it will only sharpen his desperation." Her father's warning proved prophetic sooner than either of them expected. That very evening, as Charlotte relayed the conversation to the Duke, a messenger arrived at Harrow Hall, bearing urgent news from one of the Duke's men stationed near Crane's estate. Lord Crane, it seemed, had learned of the recanted statement within hours of its filing, and had responded not with resignation, but with a fury that had sent his own household staff fleeing in fear of his temper. "He is unraveling," the Duke said grimly, reading the messenger's report by lamplight. "A man who feels his careful plans collapsing around him often becomes more dangerous, not less. I do not believe he will wait for legal proceedings to run their course now that his claim has weakened. I believe he means to act directly, and soon." Charlotte felt a fresh chill of fear settle over her, but beneath it, something steadier had begun to take root as well. A growing confidence in the partnership she and the Duke had forged together through these difficult weeks. Whatever Crane intended, she understood that she would not face it alone, and that certainty, however small a comfort against the danger still gathering around them, was enough to carry her through the uncertain nights that lay ahead. The morning air was cold and gray when Charlotte stepped out into the walled garden behind Harrow Hall, wrapped in her heaviest shawl, seeking a few quiet moments before the household stirred fully to life. She had grown careless in recent days, she knew, lulled into a false sense of safety by the passing of 2 uneventful weeks since her father's confession. The Duke had warned her repeatedly against wandering alone, but the walled garden felt safe enough, enclosed on all sides by high stone walls, with only a single locked gate leading to the outer grounds. She did not notice the figure crouched near the ivy-covered wall until it was almost too late. A hand closed roughly over her mouth before she could cry out, another arm wrapping tightly around her waist, dragging her backward toward the gate she had believed securely locked. Charlotte's mind went white with panic, her training in composure and manners utterly useless against the raw animal fear flooding through her body. She fought instinctively, driving her elbow backward into her captor's ribs with all the strength her fear could summon, earning a grunt of pain and a momentary loosening of the arm around her waist. "Be still," a low voice hissed against her ear, and she recognized it with horror as belonging to one of Crane's men, a heavy-set figure she had glimpsed once before at a distance during her father's negotiations. "His lordship only wishes to speak with you. Nothing more, if you cooperate." Charlotte did not believe him for a single moment. She twisted violently, managing to loosen his grip enough to draw breath for a scream before his hand clamped over her mouth once more, and she felt herself being dragged bodily toward the gate, her slippered feet scrabbling uselessly against the frost-covered grass. It was Grace, coming out to gather herbs for the kitchen, who first spotted the struggle from an upper window and raised the alarm that saved her. The maid's scream brought household guards running within moments, and Charlotte's captor, realizing his chances of a clean escape had vanished, shoved her roughly to the ground and fled through the gate he had somehow managed to unlock, disappearing into the trees beyond before the guards could catch him. Charlotte lay stunned in the frost-covered grass for a long moment before hands gentler than her captor's helped her to her feet. She looked up to find the Duke himself kneeling beside her, his face white with a fear she had never seen him display before, his hands trembling slightly as they checked her for injury. "Charlotte," his voice cracked on her name, all careful composure abandoned entirely. "Are you hurt? Tell me you are not hurt." "I am well," she managed, though her voice shook badly. "Frightened, but well," he said. "He said Crane only wished to speak with me." "He lied," the Duke said, fury replacing the fear in his expression, as he helped her to her feet and wrapped his own coat around her trembling shoulders. "Crane does not send men to drag women through locked gates for polite conversation. He meant to take you, Charlotte, and I very nearly failed to stop him." He escorted her inside himself, refusing to leave her side, even as Mrs. Dunmore fussed over hot tea and warm blankets, and it was only once Charlotte had been settled safely in the drawing room, color slowly returning to her face, that the full weight of what had nearly happened seemed to settle over the Duke as well. He sank into the chair beside her, his composed mask cracking entirely, and took her hand in both of his own with a desperation that surprised her. I should never have allowed you into that garden without guards, he said, his voice rough with self-recrimination. I knew Crane grew more dangerous by the day, and still I permitted myself to believe our walls alone would keep you safe. I will not make that mistake again. It was not your fault, Charlotte said, squeezing his hand gently. I grew careless too, believing myself safe simply because 2 weeks had passed without incident. We were both wrong to let our guard slip. The Duke shook his head, though his grip on her hand did not loosen. I could have lost you today. Do you understand that, Charlotte? If that maid had not looked out her window at precisely the right moment, if the guards had been a minute slower to respond, Crane would have you in his possession right now, and there is no telling what he might have done, out of spite alone, once he had you. The rawness in his voice, the depth of fear he had allowed himself to display for the first time since she had known him, struck Charlotte with sudden clarity. This was not merely the concern of a man protecting an asset, or even the dutiful concern of a husband for his wife's welfare. This was something far more personal, something that had been building quietly beneath his careful composure for weeks, without either of them acknowledging it directly. Alexander, she said softly, using his given name for the first time since their wedding day. I am safe. You saved me. Something shifted in his expression at the sound of his name from her lips, and for a long moment, he simply looked at her, his pale gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. I could not have borne it, he said finally, quietly, if something had happened to you today. I have lost enough people I cared for in this life, Charlotte. I did not think I could survive losing another, and certainly not to a man like Crane, and certainly not because of my own carelessness. You care for me, Charlotte said, not quite a question, though wonder colored her voice all the same. More than I intended to, the Duke admitted, a faint, rueful smile touching his lips despite the gravity of the day. I told you once that I expected nothing beyond duty from this marriage, Duchess. I find I must retract that statement entirely. Somewhere in these past months, you have become far more to me than a bargain struck to save you from a worse fate. Charlotte felt tears prick at her eyes, born from the lingering fear of the morning's attack, but also from something warmer and more hopeful blooming beneath it. I feel the same, she admitted. I did not expect to find genuine affection in an arrangement born from desperation and debt, but I have, Alexander. I have come to care for you a great deal. The moment stretched between them, fragile and precious after the terror of the morning, until the Duke leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, a small, tender gesture that carried more warmth than any grand declaration could have managed. Whatever comes next, he said, we will face it together. I promise you that. What came next arrived faster than either of them anticipated. Within the hour, one of the Duke's men returned from tracking Crane's fleeing servant, bearing grim news. The man had been caught attempting to cross into the next county, and under firm but careful questioning, had revealed the full extent of Crane's plan. Having failed to reclaim Charlotte through legal means, Crane had grown desperate enough to attempt outright abduction, intending to hold her at a remote hunting lodge until the Duke agreed to annul the marriage entirely, whatever the cost to his own reputation. He has lost all sense of restraint, the Duke said, pacing the study with barely contained fury as he absorbed the report. This goes beyond wounded pride now. This is a direct crime, an assault against my household and my wife. I will not simply counter this with legal maneuvering any longer, Charlotte. Crane must be stopped entirely, publicly, in a manner that leaves no possibility of further schemes. What do you intend to do? Charlotte asked, watching him with a mixture of concern and something like fierce approval. I intend to expose him, the Duke said, fully, and before witnesses who cannot be bribed or intimidated into silence. I have suspected for some time that Crane's financial affairs would not withstand close scrutiny, and I have men already investigating the true state of his estate. Combined with today's crime and the evidence of his bribed clerk, I believe we now have more than enough to destroy him entirely, in the eyes of both the law and society. Over the following days, the Duke moved with a cold, methodical determination that Charlotte found both frightening and reassuring in equal measure. His solicitors gathered sworn statements from the captured servant, from the bribed clerk whose testimony had already weakened Crane's legal claim, and from several of Crane's own creditors, who proved eager to speak once they understood the extent of his financial troubles. Meanwhile, invitations went out for a grand gathering at Harrow Hall, ostensibly a celebration of the Duke and Duchess's continued happiness in marriage, though Charlotte understood the true purpose lay in gathering witnesses for what the Duke planned to reveal. Are you certain this is wise? Charlotte asked the evening before the gathering. watching the Duke review his notes for what felt like the 100th time. Confronting Crane so publicly carries risk. What if he reacts violently, in front of your guests? I have taken precautions, the Duke assured her, setting aside his notes to take her hands in his own. Additional guards will be present, though discreetly placed. Crane is many things, Charlotte, but he is not foolish enough to act violently before an audience of his social equals, men whose good opinion he still desperately craves despite everything. His weapon has always been reputation and manipulation, not open force. We will meet him on that same battlefield and defeat him decisively there. Charlotte nodded, though anxiety continued to churn beneath her outward calm. Whatever confidence the Duke projected, she understood that tomorrow's confrontation carried genuine risk, not merely to their carefully constructed case against Crane, but to the fragile happiness they had only just begun to acknowledge between themselves. If something went wrong, if Crane found some way to twist the confrontation to his own advantage, the consequences could unravel everything they had built together these past months. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said quietly, I want you to know that these past months, despite everything, have given me more happiness than I believed possible when I first agreed to this marriage. Whatever the outcome, I do not regret the choice I made that day in my father's study. The Duke's expression softened, all trace of his earlier grim determination melting away as he pulled her gently into his arms. Nor do I regret asking you, he murmured against her hair. Whatever tomorrow brings, Charlotte, know that you have already given me more than I believed remained for me to receive in this life. We will face Crane together, and we will win. Because we have far more to fight for than he does. They held each other in the quiet of the study long into the evening, drawing strength from the fragile, hard-won bond between them, knowing that tomorrow would test that bond more severely than anything that had come before, and determined, together, to meet whatever came with courage rather than fear. Eliza arrived early the next morning to help Charlotte prepare, having insisted on staying at Harrow Hall through the entire ordeal despite Charlotte's protests that the danger might extend to her as well. She found Charlotte standing before the mirror in her finest gown, her hands steady despite the nervous energy radiating from her posture. You look every bit the Duchess, Eliza said, fastening the final clasp of Charlotte's necklace with careful fingers. Crane will not know what has struck him by the time this evening ends. I hope you are right, Charlotte said, studying her own reflection with a critical eye. I have never felt more like a stranger in my own life than I do at this moment, Eliza. So much has changed since that night I overheard my father's plans. You have changed, Eliza agreed, meeting her friend's eyes in the mirror. But not for the worse, Charlotte. You have grown stronger, braver. The girl who once trembled at the thought of Lord Crane's name would never have found the courage to stand beside her husband and face him directly, as you intend to do tonight. Charlotte managed a small smile, grateful beyond words for her friend's steady presence through everything that had unfolded these past months. Whatever happens tonight, Eliza, I want you to know how much your friendship has meant to me. I do not know that I could have borne any of this without you. You would have found the strength regardless, Eliza said firmly, squeezing her hand. But I am glad to have stood beside you all the same. Downstairs, the great hall of Harrow Hall had been transformed for the evening's gathering, chandeliers blazing with candlelight, long tables arranged with careful precision to accommodate the dozens of guests the Duke had invited. Charlotte recognized many faces from the county's higher society, men and women whose opinions carried considerable weight in matters of reputation, exactly the audience the Duke had intended to assemble for what was to come. The Duke found her in a quiet corner of the hall as the first guests began to arrive, his expression composed once more into the careful mask she had first known him by, though his eyes softened noticeably when they found her across the room. You look magnificent, he said, taking her hand and pressing a brief kiss to her knuckles. Are you ready for this? As ready as I will ever be, Charlotte admitted. Have your men confirmed Crane received his invitation? He has confirmed his attendance, the Duke said grimly. I suspect his pride would not permit him to decline. Whatever suspicions he harbors about my true intentions this evening, he will want to appear before society, as though nothing troubles him, even now. And your evidence? Everything is prepared? Everything, the Duke confirmed. The sworn statements, the financial records, the testimony of his own servant regarding the attempted abduction. My solicitor stands ready to present it all the moment the opportunity arises. Tonight, Charlotte, Lord Crane's carefully maintained reputation ends entirely. As the evening progressed, Charlotte found herself moving through the gathered crowd on the Duke's arm, exchanging careful pleasantries with guests while watching the door with growing anticipation for Crane's arrival. When he finally appeared, striding into the hall with practiced confidence, dressed in his finest evening clothes as though nothing whatsoever troubled his conscience. Charlotte felt her husband's grip on her hand tighten almost imperceptibly. "Steady," the Duke murmured, so quietly only she could hear. Let him believe himself welcome a little longer yet. Crane made his way through the crowd with practiced charm, greeting acquaintances with easy smiles that betrayed nothing of the desperate schemes churning beneath his composed exterior. When his eyes finally found Charlotte across the room, something flickered behind his practiced smile, some flash of the possessive fury she had glimpsed only briefly during her father's earliest negotiations, before he mastered it once more and inclined his head toward her with exaggerated politeness. "Your Grace." "Duchess." His voice carried just enough volume to draw the attention of nearby guests. "What a lovely gathering you have arranged this evening." "Lord Crane," the Duke said, his own voice equally pleasant on the surface, though Charlotte could feel the tension coiled beneath his calm exterior. "I am glad you could attend. I believe there are several matters we ought to discuss this evening, matters of considerable interest to our fellow guests." Something in the Duke's tone made Crane's practiced smile falter, just slightly, though he recovered quickly enough to most observers. "Matters, Your Grace? I cannot imagine what business we might have to discuss before an audience." "Can you not?" the Duke said, his voice carrying a quiet edge that promised the evening had only just begun. "I think, Lord Crane, that you will find our business tonight impossible to ignore." Charlotte watched the exchange with her heart pounding, sensing the carefully controlled calm before the confrontation that would determine so much of their future. Whatever came next, she understood that the fragile peace of these past days had reached its final threshold, and that the true reckoning with Lord Crane was about to begin in earnest, before the very audience he had hoped to charm. The great hall had grown quieter around them, guests sensing the tension beneath the Duke's pleasant tone and drawing closer to listen, drawn by the particular curiosity that always accompanies the scent of scandal. Crane's smile remained fixed in place, but Charlotte could see the tightness at the corners of his eyes, the faint sheen of sweat beginning to show at his temple, despite the cool evening air. "I confess, Your Grace, I do not understand what business could require such an audience," Crane said, his voice pitched carefully to sound amused rather than alarmed, though Charlotte could hear the strain beneath it. "Then allow me to clarify," the Duke said, gesturing to his solicitor, a slight, sharp-eyed man named Mr. Pierce, who stepped forward from where he had waited discreetly near the edge of the room, a leather folder tucked beneath his arm. "3 weeks ago, an article appeared in the local paper suggesting scandal surrounded my wife's past. I have since learned, with absolute certainty, that this article was placed at your direction, Lord Crane, using falsehoods designed to damage her reputation, out of spite for a marriage you could not prevent." A murmur rippled through the assembled guests. Crane's smile finally cracked, replaced by something colder. "A serious accusation, Your Grace, and one I would ask you to substantiate before making it before witnesses." "Gladly." Mr. Pierce opened his folder and withdrew a document, reading aloud a sworn statement from the newspaper's editor, who had confirmed receiving payment from one of Crane's known associates in exchange for the article's publication. The guests' murmuring grew louder, several faces turning toward Crane with open suspicion now rather than polite curiosity. "Furthermore," the Duke continued, his voice hardening, "you filed a fraudulent legal claim asserting my marriage was invalid, built upon documents forged with the assistance of a bribed clerk. That clerk has since confessed the full truth of the arrangement, in writing, before witnesses of unimpeachable character." Crane's face had gone pale, though he still attempted to maintain some semblance of composure. "Lies, Your Grace. Fabrications meant to embarrass me before my peers. I will not stand here and be slandered." "There is more," the Duke said, ignoring the interruption entirely, his voice carrying now to every corner of the silent hall. 12 days ago, my wife was attacked in the private garden of our own home, seized by a man who has since confessed under formal questioning that he acted on your direct instructions, intending to abduct her and hold her captive until I agreed to dissolve our marriage. The hall fell into stunned, absolute silence. Several guests turned to stare openly at Crane now, their earlier polite curiosity transformed entirely into horrified disbelief. Charlotte felt her husband's hand tighten protectively around her own as the weight of the accusation settled over the room. "That is an outrageous lie," Crane said, though his voice had lost all its earlier confidence, cracking now with something closer to panic. "I would never." "Your own servant has confessed the plot in complete detail," Mr. Pierce interrupted, holding up another sworn document. "He identifies you by name as the one who ordered the abduction, and describes in detail your intention to hold the Duchess at your hunting lodge in the northern woods, until the Duke agreed to your terms." Crane's eyes darted around the silent hall, searching desperately for some ally among the assembled faces, but found only expressions of growing revulsion staring back at him. Charlotte watched the last of his composure crumble entirely, his carefully maintained mask of respectability dissolving into something raw and desperate beneath the collective judgment of his peers. "You have no proof," he said, though the words carried little conviction now. "No proof that would stand before any court." "On the contrary," the Duke said, his voice cold and final. "I have sworn statements, corroborating testimony, and the word of magistrates already prepared to hear formal charges. But beyond the legal consequences you now face, Lord Crane, I believe your fellow guests this evening have heard more than enough to form their own judgment of your character, regardless of what any court eventually decides." He turned deliberately to address the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the full authority of his rank. "I invited you all here tonight not merely to celebrate my marriage, but to ensure that the truth of Lord Crane's conduct could no longer hide behind rumor and gossip. You have heard the evidence yourselves, from unimpeachable sources. I leave it to your own judgment what weight his name and word should carry in society going forward." The silence that followed was more damning than any shouted accusation could have managed. One by one, guests began to turn away from Crane, their expressions carefully blank in the manner of people withdrawing their favor without wishing to create further scene, but the message was unmistakable all the same. Crane stood alone in the center of the hall, surrounded by people who had, only minutes before, greeted him with warm smiles, now regarding him with the particular coldness reserved for those who had been thoroughly and publicly disgraced. "This is not finished," Crane hissed, his composure entirely abandoned now, his eyes burning with impotent fury as he looked between the Duke and Charlotte. "You have humiliated me before everyone I know, Vane. I will not forget this." "You brought this humiliation upon yourself," the Duke said, stepping slightly in front of Charlotte, a protective gesture that did not go unnoticed by the watching guests. "You attempted to steal a woman's future through fear and desperation, and when that failed, you tried to steal her through crime. Whatever consequences follow tonight, Lord Crane, you have earned every one of them through your own actions." Crane's gaze shifted to Charlotte, and for a moment, something almost pleading flickered across his desperate expression. "Charlotte, surely you understand I only ever wanted—" "Do not speak my name," Charlotte said, her voice steadier than she felt, though the fierce certainty behind the words surprised even herself. "You wanted possession, Lord Crane, not affection. You wanted a woman you could control, not a wife you could cherish. I am grateful, every single day, that my father's debt led me to the Duke's door instead of yours." A few scattered murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd at her words, and Charlotte felt a fierce, unfamiliar pride swell in her chest at having finally spoken her mind to the man who had cast such a long shadow over her recent months. Crane's expression twisted with fury at the public rejection, and for one tense moment, Charlotte feared he might lash out physically despite the crowd of witnesses surrounding them. But the Duke's guards, positioned discreetly throughout the hall exactly as promised, moved forward at precisely that moment, flanking Crane with quiet but unmistakable authority. "I believe it is time for you to leave, Lord Crane," the Duke said. "Formal charges regarding the abduction attempt will follow through proper legal channels. I would advise you to prepare your defense, though I doubt, given the evidence assembled against you, that any defense will prove sufficient." Crane looked around the hall one final time, taking in the sea of disapproving faces, the ruin of his reputation laid bare before everyone whose good opinion he had spent years carefully cultivating, and seemed finally to understand the completeness of his defeat. Without another word he turned and strode from the hall, the guards following at a discreet but watchful distance to ensure his departure, leaving behind only the low murmur of shocked conversation as the assembled guests began discussing what they had witnessed. The Duke turned to Charlotte the moment Crane had gone, his composed public mask softening immediately into something warmer and more private. "Are you well?" he asked quietly, searching her face with obvious concern. That could not have been easy, facing him so directly. "I am better than well," Charlotte said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it completely. A weight she had carried since that first terrible night overhearing her father's plans had finally lifted from her shoulders, replaced by something lighter and freer than she had felt in months. "I feel, for the first time since this all began, that I am truly safe, truly free of him." "You are," the Duke promised, taking both her hands in his own, heedless now of the watching guests around them. "Crane's reputation will not survive the formal charges to come, and even if some legal technicality spares him prison, society itself has already rendered its judgment tonight. He will find no welcome anywhere of consequence after this." The remainder of the evening passed in a warmer, gentler atmosphere than Charlotte could have imagined possible only hours before, guests approaching to offer quiet words of support and admiration for the courage she had shown in facing her would-be captor so directly. Eliza found her amid the lingering crowd, embracing her tightly with tears of relief shining in her eyes. "You were magnificent," Eliza said. "I have never been more proud to call you my friend." Later that night, once the last of the guests had departed and Harrow Hall had settled into quiet once more, Charlotte found the Duke waiting for her in the garden where, only weeks before, she had nearly been stolen from him entirely. He stood near the same ivy-covered wall, moonlight softening the sharp lines of his face into something almost gentle. "I wanted to speak with you somewhere quieter," he said as she approached, taking her hands in his, away from the noise and formality of tonight's confrontation. "There is something I have wished to say to you for some time now, Charlotte, and I find I can wait no longer to say it properly." "What is it?" she asked softly, her heart already beginning to quicken with anticipation. "When I first proposed this marriage, I told you I expected nothing beyond duty, that this would be an arrangement of convenience and nothing more." He brought her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles. "I was wrong, Charlotte, entirely wrong. Somewhere in these past months, watching you meet every hardship with courage rather than despair, watching you win over even Mrs. Dunmore's stubborn heart, watching you face Crane tonight with more bravery than most soldiers I have known could summon, I have fallen completely and irrevocably in love with you." Tears rose unbidden in Charlotte's eyes, born entirely of joy this time rather than fear or sorrow. "I love you too, Alexander," she said, the words feeling more true and more natural than anything she had spoken in her entire life. "I did not expect to find such happiness in a marriage born from debt and desperation, but I have. You have given me more than safety these past months. You have given me a true home, and a true partner, and a love I never dared hope for." The Duke pulled her gently into his arms, and beneath the quiet stars of the garden where danger had once found her, Charlotte Vane, Duchess of Harrow, finally allowed herself to fully believe in the happiness that had grown from such uncertain beginnings. Whatever trials had brought them together, whatever fear and danger had tested their fragile bond along the way, they had emerged from it not merely as two strangers bound by circumstance, but as true partners, deeply and completely devoted to one another, ready to build a life together, far brighter than either of them had once believed possible. In the weeks that followed, formal charges against Lord Crane proceeded exactly as the Duke had promised, his ruined reputation offering little protection against the weight of evidence assembled against him. He disappeared eventually from county society altogether, his estate sold to settle his own considerable debts, his name spoken thereafter only in hushed, cautionary tones as an example of ambition and cruelty finally meeting their proper reckoning. Charlotte's father, humbled by his own role in nearly losing his daughter to such danger, visited Harrow Hall more frequently in the months that followed, slowly rebuilding a relationship with Charlotte that, while never quite what it might have been under kinder circumstances, grew steadily into something resembling genuine affection and mutual respect. Her mother, too, found new confidence in the security of Charlotte's happy marriage, blossoming in ways Charlotte had never witnessed during the anxious years of her father's mounting debts. And within the gray stone walls of Harrow Hall, once so cold and guarded against the world, warmth finally took root and flourished. Mrs. Dunmore's stern exterior softened permanently into genuine fondness for the young Duchess who had brought life back into a house long shadowed by grief. Eliza remained a frequent and beloved visitor, her friendship with Charlotte only deepening with each passing season. And Duke Alexander Vane, once known throughout the county only for his coldness and his ruthless dealings, became known instead, in time, as a man utterly devoted to his wife. His guarded heart finally opened fully to the love he had once believed himself incapable of receiving. What had begun as a desperate bargain between two strangers, each seeking escape from a life of being sold and traded like property, had become instead the truest partnership either of them had ever known, proof that even the coldest beginnings could grow, with patience and courage, into something warm and lasting and entirely real. On the first anniversary of their wedding, the Duke surprised Charlotte with a quiet request that she meet him in the same church where they had exchanged their original vows, this time with only Eliza, Mrs. Dunmore, and a handful of trusted household staff in attendance. Charlotte arrived uncertain what to expect, her curiosity thoroughly piqued by her husband's uncharacteristic secrecy over the preceding days. She found him waiting near the same altar where they had first become husband and wife, though the composed, guarded expression that had marked their original ceremony had been replaced entirely by open warmth as he watched her walk toward him. I wish to renew our vows properly, he explained, taking her hands in his own as she reached him. The first time we stood here, I offered you safety and little else. I promised nothing of affection, nothing of love, because I did not yet understand what those words truly meant, nor did I believe myself capable of offering them honestly. I wish to correct that today, before witnesses who matter to us both, and speak vows that reflect the truth of what we have built together. Charlotte's eyes filled with happy tears as the Duke spoke new vows of his own composing, promises of devotion and partnership that bore no resemblance to the careful, distant arrangement of their original ceremony. She answered him in kind, her own voice steady with a certainty that would have seemed impossible to the frightened young woman who had once stood trembling in this same church, uncertain what fate awaited her at the hands of a stranger. Afterward, walking together through the churchyard in the soft afternoon light, Charlotte found herself reflecting on the strange, winding path that had brought her to this moment. She thought of that terrible night overhearing her father's plans, the desperate fear that had gripped her at the thought of Lord Crane's cruelty, the uncertain hope she had carried into her first meeting with the man who would become her husband. She thought too of all the trials that had followed, the careful courtship built from shared danger and hard-won trust, the terror of the garden attack, the fierce satisfaction of watching Crane's reputation crumble before an audience of his own peers. "You are thinking deeply about something," the Duke observed, watching her expression with the same careful attention he had shown her from their very first meeting. "I am thinking of how far we have come," Charlotte admitted, "from two strangers bound by debt and desperation to this. I would not change a single moment of it, Alexander, difficult as some of those moments were. Every trial we faced together only strengthened what we have built." "Nor would I," the Duke agreed, drawing her closer against his side as they continued their walk beneath the shading trees. "Though I confess I would have preferred a gentler path to this happiness than the one Crane forced upon us. Still, I have come to believe that the truest partnerships are often forged through adversity rather than ease. We faced the worst that fear and greed could offer, Charlotte, and we emerged from it stronger and more devoted than either of us could have imagined possible on that first night in your father's study." Charlotte smiled up at him, the last shadows of her old fears fully banished by the certainty of the love they had built together. Whatever challenges life might yet bring their way, she knew now, with unshakable confidence, that she would face them beside a man who had proven himself worthy of every ounce of trust and devotion she had to give, a man who had transformed from a feared and distant stranger into the truest partner and dearest love of her entire life. 3 years passed at Harrow Hall, and the gray stone walls that had once felt so cold and unwelcoming to Charlotte now held the warmth of a home fully alive with laughter and purpose. She had transformed the once neglected East Wing nursery, the very room where she had first glimpsed the depth of her husband's hidden grief, into a bright, cheerful space filled with sunlight and soft furnishings, ready for the child she now carried beneath her heart. Alexander found her there one afternoon, standing at the window overlooking the gardens where danger had once found her, her hand resting gently against the gentle swell of her stomach. He crossed the room quietly and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin against her shoulder as they both looked out at the grounds below. "You seem thoughtful," he said softly. "I was remembering," Charlotte admitted, leaning back against him. "This room felt so sad when I first found it, filled with dust and forgotten memories. I am glad we could give it new purpose, new life." "As you have given this entire house new life," Alexander said, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "I do not think I fully understood, before you arrived, how much this place had become a monument to grief, rather than a true home. You changed that, Charlotte, simply by being yourself." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of quick footsteps in the corridor, and moments later, Mrs. Dunmore appeared in the doorway, her stern face softened these days into something approaching genuine warmth whenever she looked upon her mistress. "Forgive the intrusion, your graces, but Miss Whitfield has arrived. She says she has news she is eager to share." Eliza swept into the nursery moments later, her cheeks flushed with excitement, and her eyes bright with happiness that Charlotte immediately recognized. "I am to be married," Eliza announced before anyone could ask. "Mr. Bennett Cole has finally worked up the courage to ask, after nearly a year of careful courtship, and I have accepted him gladly." Charlotte embraced her dearest friend warmly, delighted beyond words to see Eliza's own happiness finally blossoming, after years of quiet devotion to a man who had taken his time, proving himself worthy of her affection. "I am so happy for you, Eliza. Truly. You deserve every happiness life has to offer." "As do you," Eliza said, glancing meaningfully at Charlotte's rounded stomach. "It seems this family grows in more ways than one this year." The wedding took place that autumn in the same small church where Charlotte and Alexander had exchanged their own vows years before, and where they had later renewed those promises with words born of genuine love rather than careful obligation. Charlotte stood beside Eliza as her closest attendant, watching her dearest friend begin her own journey toward happiness with a man who looked at her with the same open devotion Alexander had learned, slowly and carefully, to show Charlotte over their years together. Life at Harrow Hall continued to unfold with a steadiness and contentment that Charlotte had once believed impossible, back in those frightened early days when her future had seemed entirely controlled by her father's debts and Lord Crane's cruel ambitions. Word occasionally reached them of Crane himself, reduced now to a diminished, solitary existence in a distant county, his fortune entirely spent, his name carrying no weight whatsoever among people who had once courted his favor. Charlotte found she felt no satisfaction in his downfall beyond a quiet, settled peace, the simple knowledge that justice had finally been served, and that she need never fear him again. Her father, too, had continued his slow transformation in the years since his confession, growing into a gentler, more honest version of the man he had once been. He visited Harrow Hall regularly now, delighting in small ways in the growing family his daughter had built, offering advice on estate matters when asked, and, more importantly, simply offering his presence and support without the calculating self-interest that had once defined nearly every interaction between them. "I never imagined I would come to enjoy your father's company," Alexander admitted one evening, watching Henry Ashby laugh warmly with Mrs. Dunmore over some small joke in the drawing room below. "But people can change, it seems, given sufficient reason and sufficient time to reflect upon their failures." "He has tried very hard these past years," Charlotte agreed. "I do not think I could have imagined, on that terrible night I overheard his plans for me, that we would ever reach this place of genuine affection between us. But I am glad we have. Life feels too short to carry old grievances forever, when genuine change and remorse are offered in their place." As winter approached and Charlotte's time drew nearer, the household settled into careful anticipation, Mrs. Dunmore overseeing preparations with the same brisk efficiency she brought to every aspect of managing Harrow Hall, while Alexander hovered nearby with a nervous energy that Charlotte found both amusing and deeply touching in a man normally so composed and controlled. "You need not worry so constantly," she told him one evening, watching him pace before the fire in their private sitting room. "Women have been having children since the beginning of time, Alexander. I am strong and healthy, and the physician has assured us there is no cause for particular concern." "I know," he admitted, coming to sit beside her and taking her hand in his own, "but I find myself unable to fully master my worry all the same. You are everything to me, Charlotte. The thought of anything happening to you, even in the course of something as natural as childbirth, fills me with a fear I cannot entirely reason away." Charlotte squeezed his hand gently, understanding the depth of loss that shaped his fear. The sister taken by fever, the first engagement ended by illness, the long years of guarding his heart against further grief before she had finally, patiently, taught him to trust in happiness again. "I understand your fear," she said softly, "but I promise you, Alexander, I intend to be here for a great many years yet, watching our child grow, growing old beside you in this house that has become such a true home to us both." Their daughter arrived on a cold morning in early winter, her cries filling Harrow Hall with a sound of new life that seemed to banish the last lingering shadows of old grief from its gray stone walls entirely. Alexander held his daughter for the first time with hands that trembled slightly, his composed expression cracking entirely into open, unguarded wonder as he looked down at the small, perfect face gazing back up at him. "She is beautiful," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion he made no effort to hide. "Charlotte, she is absolutely beautiful. What shall we name her?" Charlotte asked, exhausted but glowing with happiness, as she watched her husband cradle their daughter with such careful, tender devotion. Alexander considered the question for a long moment, his gaze moving between his wife and his daughter with an expression of complete contentment. "Grace," he said finally, "after the maid whose quick thinking saved you in that garden, all those years ago. Without her courage that day, we might never have had this moment at all." Charlotte smiled through happy tears, reaching out to take her daughter into her own arms. "Grace Vane," she said softly, testing the name against the small, sleeping face nestled against her. "It suits her perfectly." In the years that followed, Harrow Hall filled further still with the sounds of children's laughter, as young Grace was joined eventually by a brother, and the once somber gray walls that had witnessed so much grief in generations past became instead a true home, filled with warmth and joy in every corner. Charlotte often found herself standing in that same garden where danger had once found her, watching her children play beneath the same trees, and marveling at the strange, winding path that had carried her from a frightened young woman facing a cruel fate to this life of genuine, hard-won happiness. Alexander, too, had transformed completely from the cold, guarded duke whose reputation had once inspired such fear throughout the county. Those who had known him only by rumor before his marriage scarcely recognized the warm, devoted father and husband he had become, a man who had learned, through Charlotte's patient love and unwavering courage, that opening his heart to genuine connection carried far greater rewards than the careful isolation he had once believed necessary for survival. On quiet evenings, when the children had been settled to bed and the great house had grown peaceful around them, Charlotte and Alexander often sat together in the same study where their strange bargain had first been struck all those years before, reflecting on everything that had brought them to this place of contentment. "Do you ever think of how differently things might have gone?" Charlotte asked one such evening, watching the firelight play across her husband's face, so much softer and more open now than the guarded stranger who had once offered her rescue from a cruel fate. "If you had not come to my father's house that night, if Crane's schemes had succeeded in the garden, if any of 100 small moments had unfolded differently." "I try not to dwell on such possibilities," Alexander admitted, drawing her close against his side. "Though I confess, in my darker moments, I have imagined what might have become of you had I arrived even a single day later, or had that maid not looked out her window at precisely the right moment in the garden. Such thoughts serve little purpose beyond reminding me how precious and fragile our happiness truly is, and how grateful I remain, every single day, that fate brought us together, despite everything that conspired to keep us apart." Charlotte pressed closer against him, grateful beyond words for the life they had built together from such uncertain and dangerous beginnings. Whatever trials had once threatened to tear them apart before their bond had even properly formed, they had emerged from every one of them stronger, their love proven and tested by fire, until it had become something unshakable, a true partnership built to last through whatever years still lay ahead of them. Outside, snow began to fall softly over the grounds of Harrow Hall, blanketing the gardens in quiet white peace, while within its walls, a family once nearly destroyed by greed and cruelty continued instead to flourish, warm and safe and deeply, completely loved.